We're very large into infusion therapy, predominantly infusion pumps, enteral feeding devices, things along those lines. Plus, we have a large range of high density and ultrasonic surgical tools for phacoemulsification, some other things, soft tissue debridement activity. One of the bigger trends that I see right now, especially based in our infusion world, is the IT infrastructure associated with both acute care hospital and also home care activity, and the ability to be able to both upload and download not only specific medication limits, but also the results of infusion therapies to any kind of centralized system, being a server-based and or hospital systems via Wi-Fi inside the hospital, and either GSM or CDMA for the home care side of things. And I think so that healthcare IT is one of the biggest issues for us these days.
Good afternoon, Kevin Conway. I head up business development for the medical division within the Stryker Corporation. Stryker, a $8.5 billion device company specializing primarily in orthopedics. I'm with the medical division, which is a little bit different than the rest in that our focus are products for the patient room, most notably hospital beds and patient handling equipment for the patient room. The last larger acquisition we did was the purchase of Geiger Industries, $150 million, put us in a much better position from a surface perspective, which is a fancy name for mattresses that go on beds. As far as trends coming up, connectivity is a big focus for us. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've been able to package smart technology into our patient handling devices. And now is the time, because our customers are telling now is the time for us to capture that patient-centric and bed-centric information, capture it, put it in a form that's usable for nurses and caregivers, and then upload that to the EMR system. So that's a big focus for us right now.
My name is Geiger, and I'm heading Accelmed. Accelmed is a medical device investment firm. We invest anywhere from $1 million in seeding seasoned entrepreneurs to a few dozens of millions, mainly in more mature companies out of Israel and anything in between. We have started our activity back in 2009. We consummated 9 transactions since, already sold 2 companies and announced the sale of the 3rd one. And we are continuing to invest in currently almost in a pace of almost 1 every month. Regarding exciting transactions, so I wouldn't discriminate among my babies, so I wouldn't speak about any of my portfolio companies. I would speak on the deals that I still haven't done, but I hope to do. So we are currently bidding for a mid-size spine company with a nice EBITDA and revenue growth, about 28% growth, which is in spine is quite rare. And the idea for that, it's a US company with a full infrastructure, anywhere from manufacturing in Far East, in China, and all the chains that sell global sales, is to create a presence as a platform to bring Israeli innovation, specifically currently one of our portfolio companies, but potentially others, into the US and global marketplace. This is our philosophy, and actually we are bidding for another company in cardiology now. So we are looking to build a global presence and have another alternative for Israeli companies other than being acquired, which is the most usual way.
Yeah. Great. Maybe a question to the strategic folks on the panel. Maybe I'll just start with Carl. Given all the recent issues with the FDA and the perception shared among many that the FDA is broken, one of the things that emerging companies grapple with is the right regulatory strategy. And I know, speaking for a lot of Israeli companies, a lot of companies choose to pursue the strategy of obtaining a CE mark with the intention of developing commercialization and then pursuing a US strategy later. Maybe if I can get a comment from the panel as far as their thoughts and advice to some of the folks in the audience, and also what type of value do you put on OUS revenue and the traction that companies are able to achieve as you look at the timing of approaching some of these companies for strategic transactions?
Okay, so maybe I'll pick off the second question first, okay, which is value to OUS revenue. Absolutely, we put value on OUS revenue. We look at our opportunities on a global basis, and so having some initial commercialization is an important proof of principle Depending on, whether there is or isn't clinical data, that's another variable. There's a high, in my own opinion, I believe there's a very high cost to a startup to commercialize in the United States. And so that's a broader challenge than just simply, gaining a 510K, obviously. And that's an important threshold for a startup company to make some decisions around that inflection point.
Okay, so as long as there's sufficient clinical data obtained outside the U.S., that would be sufficient for you as you pursue transactions.
Again, it kind of depends on the product. Okay. Some products may be very straightforward to assess and due diligence in terms of understanding the value proposition, and others may require more data.
Okay. And Uri, it would be good to get the perspective from the investor side as you're advising some of your companies in developing strategy. What's the thought process as you pursue this?
Well, I think that it's first, this respect of US or Europe is what your exit strategy. And unlike many others, there is a cliche that every company needs to pretend to be built to be a huge company in order to be sold later. I don't believe in that. I believe that you may try to play a game, but in most cases, the guys on my right are clever enough to know if you can do it alone. If this is a one-product company, they will never make it to market alone. So I think that first you need to decide, what company, and there are very few companies, probably in our portfolio, 1 or 2, that can be independent, large companies in the future. But those are rare. I would say, 10 to 20% maybe, and probably even less. So you start with your exit strategy and what you believe is the best value creation. And in general, I see 3 value creation points in the lifespan of a company. The first one is the clinical proof. So you have a product, you have developed it to a stage, you have done first in man, you have some clinical proof on limited number of patients. In some cases, that will be sufficient, especially if this is something which is highly strategic for specific companies, and it's also necessitates a long PMA process in the US. Others will have to do some initial commercial proof, and that's where the answer to your question comes. It's usually easier to do it in Europe, so obviously a CE is a way. It's a cliche because to get a CE does mean you can really sell in Europe. It's a diversified market. It's not one market, and Europe is not Europe. It's not a country. OUS is not a country. It's many different countries. So each market has its own characteristic, and you need really to build a strategy well in advance when in the very early beginning, how you going to position yourself and sell out of the US. And in a bracket, I will say that in some cases you would find it that a US pathway may be even faster than a CE, even you don't believe in the beginning. I can give examples. So the second point is initial proof of concept, usually in Europe, but not necessarily. And the last one, which very few Israeli companies like to be there, is to be sold based on EBITDA multiples and sales multiples. So that will take you much longer time, and very few companies can actually be capital efficient to absorb the dozens of millions and maybe more needed in order to get that, and still enable to bring their investors and founders that started the company a nice return. So this strategy is tailored only to specific companies, where only the middle exit is proper, with very well proper and detailed planning and execution at the right time.
Okay, thank you. I'll point this question towards Kevin. One topical item right now is the impending medical device excise tax. And clearly, both large and small companies are touting the negative impact that they think this tax is going to have, whether it be reduced R&D spend, reduced personnel, increased prices, and so forth. And I know Stryker had made an announcement that it was between the economy and the excise tax was cutting a significant amount of folks. I would appreciate your comment on the tax, but one thing specifically, because the tax is going to be on sales versus on profits, the feeling is it's going to have a disproportionate impact on smaller emerging companies, because as they start to generate revenue, they're going to have less capital to invest back in the business. So I would like your perspective on what you think the impact is, both on large and small companies, and whether this changes the timing of how you start looking at companies as relates to perhaps acquisitions?
So no doubt the smaller company's going to feel it a lot more than a larger company. The good news is, though, Stryker has been budgeting for this. For 2 years now, our strat plans across the various divisions have been budgeting for this. So that's good news. There's no, by the way, there's no corporate slush fund that is going to absorb this. All the divisions have to absorb their part, and any deals that we bring forward have to have that. We've got that built into our model. So, it's in our mindset. Frankly, I don't see, if it's the right deal for us to bring that technology into the U.S., we're not going to let that tax be a showstopper. We'll find a way to make the model work. The luxury is we can, typically you can charge a little bit more in the U.S. for those products. We can leverage a $8 billion supply chain. We can probably make that product for less, and we'll just find our way through that. But for the small guys, no doubt it's going to be tough.
Okay. Thank you. Marty, a question for you. Clearly, Moog is a diversified company with significant presence outside of medical products. As the person running the medical products division, I'm curious for you to share with the audience specific trends within medical devices that you see particularly intriguing, and especially given the manufacturing expertise of Moog. I know a lot of your products within medical products are geared towards the manufacturing side, but what's the thought process going forward as you look to expand?
Well, can I just do one quick answer to the 2.3%
sure.
tax as well?
Absolutely.
Keeping in mind what that 2.3% excise tax is on, unfortunately it's on revenue. It's also part of Obamacare. It's really fundamentally to pay for a $20 billion hit with respect to that. That is coming up for Supreme Court review in the fall, so it could be devastating to small companies that also could go away. There's also that possibility, and I'd say it's a 50-50 scenario today based upon what everyone knows about it. So we'll see what goes on. I don't think you want to start a company on a 50-50 proposition. As far as exciting technologies go, and some other things that we would be looking at, again, we are a diversified company. I came out of the aerospace world, 20-some years in the aerospace world to start the medical devices thing. I think some of the most interesting things are technologies associated with surgical tools. And ultimately, when you come back to surgical tools, I think there's a whole series of things associated with surgical simulation. Our company's involved in a couple of different forms of surgical simulation where you actually practice the surgery prior to the surgery on a device. I think everyone's very familiar with the Da Vinci system, Intuitive, and their surgical robotics. Perhaps there's a way to actually practice on that without having to engage with respect to the device itself, which is a very expensive installation, and an hour on that is extremely expensive. And some other things associated with dental activity, dental training. Our company in the Netherlands manufactures and designs and manufactures a simulator for dentistry, any kind of oral surgeries and things along those lines. So I think surgical simulation is going to be an enormously powerful and impactful thing going forward, especially when it comes to regulations and some of the regulatory side of things, which will require a number of hours on a simulator prior to actually cutting on a body or drilling a tooth. So I think there's a huge marketplace available for that. And I would imagine over the next 10 years or so, it'll be much more large opportunity and growing quite rapidly.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Carl. We've heard due to the regulatory hurdles, it's increasingly difficult to get reimbursed for incremental innovation. And therefore, the focus going forward is going to be more on acquiring companies or developing technologies that truly meet an unmet clinical need or alternately drive down the cost of healthcare. Maybe you could just comment on that as it relates to your strategic efforts and,
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't look at something from a targeting standpoint, solely because there's a reimbursement driver. You know, we look at, you know, fundamentally what fits with our business, what's adjacent to what we do, and you know, reimbursement is part of the equation, you know, of value creation.
Okay, but as you look for, say, acquisitions, is it just simply would you look at things that are just simply evolutionary with regard to where Bar spends its time? Are you looking for, like Nutanix, for example, I wouldn't consider necessarily evolutionary. It's a really next generation type of technology.
Yeah, you know, my own view of it is, you know, I think there's value in pursuing a balanced portfolio. So at times, you know, there may be an opportunity to buy some more incremental innovation, okay. And there's times where you'll want to, you know, take that jump and buy something that has good fit with your core strategy, but, you know, can represent the next generation of where you focus.
Okay, thank you. Uri, a question for you. When you look at investment opportunities, what's really the most important criteria that you look for? Is it the subsector within medical devices? Is it the stage of development? Is it regulatory hurdles and so like the strategy that you look at a key component, or as it relates to therapeutic versus diagnostic? How do you look at things as far as your priorities?
So I think it's a combination of all what you've said and plus. So first, of course, the human factors. I mean, who are the people behind it, and our belief that they can create and be a partner and face the difficulties that a startup and building a company necessitate. But more than that, our investment strategy is somehow different, and I think we had a discussion prior to the panel before lunch. We usually don't rely on our deal flow process to generate deals. We do have a deal flow that comes on a weekly basis, but we define in advance certain areas of interest that we find potentially interesting for us. And doing so, we put a team in place, which include physicians and analysts and et cetera, and we look on a global basis what technologies there are, what companies are there, what execution strategy may fit in this field. And we have done work, and I have books on anywhere from general surgery to diabetic and healthcare IT and structural heart on the different part of which, and many others. Now we're doing one on orthobiologics, which is our next topic to concentrate. We just did it on structural, so we did 3 deals, and we're probably going to do the 4th today or tomorrow. So, you know, we define an area, we look globally, we invest globally, and that's the way we do it. So we don't rely on a standard deal flow. And then it's a more strategic and philosophic point of view. It's also because we are very flexible. We have no constraints of structure, deal structure, debt, equity. And for Israeli terms, we are small fish in the big pond, but in the Israeli pond, since we can place dozens of millions per deal or even more if needed, so we can look, you know, from smaller to larger deals and see how they work together. Okay. So it's more strategic view rather than look at the deal flow and marks, check the marks.
And just a follow-up question, or if you don't mind, as the one investor on the panel, maybe you could just talk a little bit about the availability of capital in Israel for funding emerging growth companies, and when the right time is to start searching out for foreign investors, U.S. or otherwise.
I think Israel has, that's known, although I have maybe 2 ideas how to potentially solve it. Not that I'm such a, you know, probably others thought on this before me, but our problem is anywhere in the gap between the incubator. So we have an incubator program that gives anyone that really has a decent or semi-decent idea $500,000 to start something. With $500,000, you cannot do much. I think on the other side, when you do have sound clinical data, you have sufficient both Israeli investors now, and I'm happy that, you know, there are new funds coming into the play, and of course American funds that can join, and ourselves. And unless you're a seasoned entrepreneur that can get money just because who you are, you're in Death Valley anywhere after the incubator before clinical data. And that's a big gap to cover. I think that this isn't a problem. It can be overcome by potentially 2 things. First, more microfunds. There are currently 2 microfunds in Israel They're doing a great job in bridging this gap. So I wish there were more $20, $30 million funds that can give $1, $2 million for smaller companies to bridge this gap. And potentially a change in the incubator program, instead of giving anyone that just has a nice PowerPoint, $500,000, give it to half or third of the number of companies, but give them $1 to $2 million each, so they can get to an achievement which is meaningful and create value. So this may help in overcoming this huge problem between the incubator and the clinical data.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is to all the strategic parties on the panel. What's your current thinking with regard to the stage that a company or technology needs to become of interest to you as you, whether it be strategic investment, licensing, partnering, or acquisition? Are you inclined to wait until a company has demonstrated commercial traction before it becomes more interesting to you, or would you rather get involved much earlier so you could help form the regulatory strategy and the commercialization strategy? Maybe I'd start with Kevin.
Sure. So we do very little investing, and the little we do is in the U.S. We are definitely a late-stage acquisition company. It's a tough one because we like to find technologies OUS that are at a point where maybe there's a CE mark, maybe they've begun the process of filing a 510K, and it's still pre-revenue, but taking it over at that time. The challenge we face is, that I face, I think my peers that my company faces, trying to take a rational approach to the regulatory requirements. Some of the technologies we look at are, primarily class 2, and some of our other divisions deal with class 3 devices. And personally, I like the thought of finding mid-stage, soon to be late stage, where we can leverage our regulatory, leverage our R&D, and bring that to market sooner than later.